A good question for young people to ask about God is, can God make a rock too big for him to pick up? The reason why this is a good question is because thinking about this question seriously will help us understand God better and lots of other important questions. Now, God is typically described as someone who can do anything. And the problem is, if God could do anything, then God could make the rock. But if God could make the rock that's too big for God to pick up, then God couldn't make the rock. But what if God couldn't make the rock because God can pick up any rock? Well, then God can't make the rock. It seems like no matter what you do, there's something God can't do. This is what's known as a dilemma. A dilemma is when you're faced with two options and both of them seem wrong. It's like if I asked you if you wanted to be eaten by a pack of wolves or do you want to be eaten by a bear. You probably don't want to do either of those things. And so when it comes to this question about God, we're stuck with this dilemma. It seems like there's something God can't do. But God's supposed to be all-powerful, right? God's supposed to be able to do anything. Well, if God can do anything, then can't God make the rock? But then if God can't make the rock, then God can't do anything. But if God could make the rock, then God couldn't pick up the rock. So we see the problem. This is what is known as a classic Omnipotence Paradox. Now those words sound fancy, but they're not really all that fancy. Omnipotence is just the technical word for all-powerful. Basically, that God can do anything. And a paradox is when it seems like something doesn't fit, basically. So, omnipotence has a technical, specific definition into. So, the way philosophers put it is that for God to be omnipotent would mean that God can actualize any state of affairs. And what that means is God can make anything, any situation become actual or become real or actually happen. Now, to think about this question of God making this rock, what we need to do is first ask ourselves a different question. And by asking a different question, it'll help us understand the question about the rocks. So, let's ask ourselves this. Could God make a square triangle? Could God create a square triangle? Now, oftentimes I've asked young people and teenagers to, come up to the board and draw for me a square triangle, or maybe a square circle or something like that. And I've had teenagers tell me that they'll come up to the board and they'll grab the marker and they'll go to start to draw, and then they'll say, wait, what? Wait. And so the problem with drawing a square triangle is best seen if you sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and actually try to draw one. And it's very simple. What is a triangle? A triangle is a shape that has three sides. What is a square? A square is a shape that has four sides. So the only way that you can draw a triangle that is also a square is if the number 3 is the same thing as the number 4. But the more we think about it, the more we realize that the number 3 is not the same thing as the number 4. Well, let's ask it this way. Could God make the number 3 the same thing as the number 4? God can do anything, right? Well, what are we asking God to do exactly? In other words, what state of affairs are we asking God to make actually make the number 3 equal the number 4 so that we can draw a square triangle? Well, the more we think about it, the more we realize what we're asking God to do is what philosophers call logically impossible. Now, logically impossible sounds fancy, but what it means is we're asking God to do nothing. That's what we're saying. for something to be logically impossible, it is meaningless. In other words, this state of affairs, where the number 3 is the same thing as the number 4, what is that exactly? How do you define that? What is it that we're saying God needs to do? God needs to make actual. It isn't really a thing. It doesn't actually have a definition because it defines itself as one thing and then it defines itself as not that thing. It may be easier to think of it this way. Can God make a married man who is also not married? Can God do that? Well, that's not really a thing. It's logically impossible, right? So, the conclusion of Christian theologians over the centuries is that God cannot do the logically impossible, or to say it in a more accurate and technically precise way, God cannot bring into existence a state of affairs that has no meaning, a meaningless, empty state of affairs. In other words, when we ask God to create a square circle or a square triangle, we're asking God to create nothing. And so the fact that God can't do that isn't really the right way to put it. What we really mean is it's just not a thing to do or not do. Now let's go back to our question about the rocks. Can God create a rock too big for God to lift? Well, what we're doing is we're really saying, does God have the power of not having a power? Well, that seems like it doesn't make any sense. Again, why should not having a power be a power? Why should we say that that's not a power? That is a power. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's logically impossible. Now, so what this means is it is in fact not a problem for any concept of God for us to say that God cannot do the logically impossible, because when we're asking God to do the logically impossible, we're asking God to do nothing. Now, alternatively, let's say that you decide, well, I choose to believe that God can do the logically impossible. Okay? Now, this is a conclusion that is inconsistent, and Christian theologians over the centuries have concluded that this is incorrect. But let's just say that you decide to believe it's true. The question about the rocks is still not a problem, even in that situation, because if we say that God can do the logically impossible, then God can create a rock too big for God to lift, and God can lift it. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense. That's meaningless. Exactly. That's exactly my point. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for your time.